Hi there, welcome to the Cotswold Explorer. I'm Robin Shuckburgh. This is Gizmo and Widget, my travelling companions. And welcome back to our series, Hidden Gems in the Cotswolds. We're travelling on your behalf through the centre of the Cotswolds, seeking out smaller places you might easily not come across, little villages, churches, even the occasional artefact. Come with us and let's go and find some wonderful Cotswold gems. And today you find Ross, Widget, Gizmo and me in the little village of Winson. We're still in the centre of the Coln Valley, high up in the valley, and it is absolutely beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful valleys in the whole of the Cotswolds. And this little village is a prime example. We're going to show you around. If you take the lane north-northwest from the world-famous village of Bybury, leaving the Swan Hotel on your right and the river on your left, you will have started your journey down one of the most picturesque lanes in the whole county. The first of the villages you come to is Ablington, a village we've visited before, and details of which you can find elsewhere on our channel, where you will cross a bridge over the embryonic River Coln and continue up the right bank towards its source, through a string of breathtakingly beautiful settlements. The first you come to is Winson. Winson is a chapelry of Bybury and is a sleepy little place, just a few metres off the lane that runs the length of the river. It built up next to a ford over the stream, making good use of the extremely fertile river valley and the huge benefits that came with water power. There were 3 mills in the village, only one of which, Winson Mill, about a mile northwest, still exists. When we passed it on this lovely sunny later summer's day, the people who lived there were making the very most of the sunshine next to the river. Winson is now, as far as we can see, entirely residential. Even the old school in the corner of the churchyard has been converted into a house. There is a small triangular green in the centre of the village, overlooked by a very handsome house indeed. Winson Manor is described in Pevsner's architectural guide as a charming, compact, double-pile classical house, handsomely detailed, built in 1740 for Richard Howes, Surgeon General to the Army. It stands, raised slightly, above the green, but close enough to study with ease. It has often been attributed to the architect James Gibbs, and there is no doubt that Howes could have known Gibbs, as they were both involved with St Bartholomew's Hospital in London, but it seems more likely that the house was designed by a local architect, using Gibbs's highly influential Book of Architecture, published 12 years or so previously. Running off the green in a southerly direction is Ditch Lane. Walking down here you pass the lovely 17th, 18th century manor farm, and at the end some beautiful cottages of the same period, one of them thatched. You might notice that a footpath drops left off this little lane into the valley. Usually these footpaths are marked with some rather unsightly, brightly coloured, round, council-made plastic badges stuck to a post. Not in this village. Beautifully carved signs announcing the path have been created by the villagers so as not to spoil the look of the place. Turning right at the end up the slope, you find the small early Norman village church, again raised above the road, standing proud. It's a small church, but charming and friendly, with a churchyard filled with the interesting headstones, crosses, and a unique collection of 9 18th century chest tombs. These latter are beautifully carved and shaped and bear some examination. The inside consists of nave and chancel only, with many Norman remnants. The chancel arch is Norman, and there is a Norman window, deep set and still existing in the north wall. The high chancel roof is supported by carved and painted corbel heads, and the walls are decorated with images of vines and honeysuckle. This painting is 19th century, as is the floor, set with colourful mosaics. The font is Norman, but set on more recent little pillars. The pulpit is stone and probably 15th century, although well restored. There is a 19th century organ made by J.C. Bishop of Thame in Oxfordshire, and some good glass, mostly 19th and 20th century. All in all, a lovely small church in some truly wonderful surroundings. I hope you've enjoyed our little spin round Winson. It is absolutely beautiful, and yet again in this extraordinary river valley, it shows you what the sort of essence of the Cotswolds is like. The beauty of this valley just gets better and better as we travel a short distance higher up the River Coln and come to the little village of Coln Rogers. Now, we're moving slowly up the Coln River, one of my very favourite rivers in the Cotswolds, and it's so beautiful here in the sunshine. We can't wait to show you round. It's always fun researching the history of Cotswold villages and finding the things amongst the reams of clerical and geographical history that might amuse you all. It's almost always the case that a few things stand out, and Coln Rogers is no exception. Firstly, it seems that this is the village from whence the surname Rogers is derived. I'm not quite certain why this should surprise me, particularly as my own name Shuckburgh is derived from a village in Warwickshire of a similar size, albeit less beautiful, but I'm sure it might be one of interest to all those with the Rogers moniker. The name recalls Roger of Gloucester, who gave the manor of Coln to Gloucester Abbey in 1105. The valley rises steeply from the narrow meadows surrounding the Coln River, creating the sheltered, cosy feel to the village that is so much treasured by Cotswold lovers. Horses gambol and roll in the lush grasslands and the foot of the valley, and there's a great sense that all is well with the world. There is the usual buzz of agricultural machinery around us, whilst the red kites and buzzards circle above, ready to pick off any rodents disturbed by the passing tractors. We notice that some of the cottages show signs of people working from home, one of the saviours of villages like this. It's good to see the good side of our extraordinary communications revolution in action for a change, although I have to admit that the signal strength for the internet could be a bit of a problem. Another interesting fact I came across is that this is one of only 53 communities in the entire country who lost no one in the carnage of the First World War. These 53 places are known as the Thankful Villages. The phrase was coined by Arthur Mee in the 1930s in the first volume of his guide to The King's England. To put this in context, there are tens of thousands of villages and towns in the UK, and only 53 came off scot-free from the 1418 war. Only 14 are doubly thankful in that they lost no one in either First or Second World Wars. Whilst Coln Rogers is not one of those, it nevertheless feels appropriate that this wonderfully relaxed place, where the horrors of geopolitics seem a million miles away, should be a member of the rare Thankful Villages band. The last time we came across a village with this distinction was at Upper Slaughter, who are amongst the 14 doubly thankful communities. You can, of course, find our film on that village on our YouTube channel. The principal buildings of this village are grouped around the church. The barns and outbuildings of the original farm have been converted into private houses during the 20th century, and the outlying pigeon house, the other side of the river, looks well maintained and sound, almost certainly indicating a reliably conscientious owner prepared to take on the massive task of keeping up one of these lovely houses. Whilst it's easy to find early 20th century descriptions of the increasing dilapidation of all the villages on the Coln, these days, fortunately, the beauty of the place is so appreciated that huge sums of money are available to maintain these historical structures. Over the centuries, the land in the valley was initially used as small-holding arable land, gradually combined together to form larger farms where sheep and eventually specialised Charolais cattle were grazed, and more recently the fields were divided into horse paddocks, which trend has spread to nearby Fossbridge and Pindrup. The church was built before the Norman conquest of 1066, which makes the building particularly fascinating. It has an almost complete late Saxon nave and chancel. Apart from the enlargement of the windows, inevitable as glass became cheaper and stronger, and the addition of the west tower, this church gives us a clear vision of Saxon architecture. Our favourite Pevsner guide, as always slightly irritated by any overworking, comments that the church has suffered too many restorations, one in 1844-5 and two more by the constantly present Waller and Son in 1888 and later in 1910. There is a Norman tub-shaped font on a scalloped base, a 15th century stone pulpit, quite plain but elegant, and the church contains a wonderful medieval oak chest with a studded surface and its original ironwork. There's some very good 15th century glass in the northeast window, and mid to late 19th century windows in the rest of the church. There are several marble monuments to local families in the church, and in the churchyard, just north of the nave, a headstone to David Talbot Rice, the art historian and an expert in Byzantine art, who was from a very important local family and died in 1972. I do hope you've enjoyed our little spin around Coln Rogers. It's extraordinary, this place. We're having such fun in the Coln Valley. It's the sort of essence of the Cotswolds. And of course it's right in the middle of them. Higher still up the valley, still following the lovely little lane along the riverside, we come to Coln St. I really like this place. It's extraordinarily pretty. And we're going to show you around. Come with me. When I suggested to Ross that we meet in Coln St. to film, I'm sure I wasn't quite clear that the village was at the very centre of the Cotswold region. I certainly wasn't aware that the village itself was a kind of distillation of all that is extraordinary about this part of England. 7 years ago, we decided somewhat randomly to concentrate our YouTube efforts in the Cotswolds. I suspect we were being quite pragmatic about it. The Cotswolds, a famous tourist destination, was likely to give us a bit of a leg up when it came to garnering interest from the hundreds of thousands of you who have since then been so wonderfully kind as to take us to your hearts. We have visited over 200 villages since, covering practically all those north of the A40, along with lots south of that line. the gaps between which we will fill over the next year or so. But for now, it's perhaps appropriate that we come to this little place, bang in the middle of the region, and discover its remarkable beauty. Because what we post on our channel will be there for the foreseeable future, and also because we hope that both you and many generations of your successors will find it interesting to visit our films, we do our best not to embrace too many issues of transient things, like the animals in the fields, the new planting of different crops, or, perhaps more importantly, the bad things, like the incredible, unforgivable, and to me, inexplicable way in which we have contaminated our waterways. I mentioned in my introduction that the Coln Valley is, in my view, one of the most beautiful river valleys in the world. I even suggested that there were fish in the stream. When I was a child, the river was literally crystal clear, and you could see with ease the trout swimming contentedly in the sweet water. That is no longer the case. In fact, spotting any aquatic wildlife is extremely challenging. I fervently hope that those of you who are watching this film in 2045 will easily be able to reassure my ghost that the river has recovered. At the very least in Coln St, which is, after all, less than 15 miles away from the river's source. A natural spring at Sevenhampton, a village you won't be surprised to hear we visited before. I hope to produce, in the fairly near future, a film about the aquatic catastrophe we've managed to wreak upon this lovely part of the world. But here, as I have explained, is not the place. Instead, we can look at the breathtaking beauty of this little village. Peacefully centred around a lovely oak tree, not old, so we must assume planted by a current resident or committee, where every building shows the signs of love and care needed for these ancient structures. The barns have all been repurposed as houses. There are absolutely no amenities. Every bottle of milk you need if you live here would involve a motorcar drive. But if your dream is to live in a peaceful, utterly beautiful rural community, where every single person in the village knows every other person in the village, then this is almost certainly the place for you. At a price, of course. From the year 1060-ish, this village was in the possession of the Abbey of St Denis in Paris. A small priory was set up here, populated by monks from France, who stayed until Henry V decided in 1414 to seize what were then known as alien priories. In 1467, the manor fell to Tewkesbury Abbey, until the dissolution, when the manor was leased in two separate portions to Hugh Westwood of Chedworth, the founder of Northleach Grammar School and of the almshouses at Bybury. The church of St James the Great was called St Catherine's in the late 13th century, St Denis's in the 18th, and was thought to have once borne an invocation to St Kenelm. In the very centre of the village, it's an early Norman church, preserving its original plan of chancel, nave, and central tower. The tower has a top section that is very obviously narrower than the rest, added probably in the 15th century, at which time they blocked in the north bell opening. It creates an unusual look. Although the third stage is narrower than those below it, the extra weight thus placed on the lower stages distorted the tower arches. Though the western arch survived, the eastern arch was rebuilt. It may have been the distortion of the tower that necessitated the rebuilding of the chancel roof. The corbel heads that apparently came from the chancel were used to support the new, flat, parapeted roof of the nave. The restorations in 1848 and again by the famous Waller and Son in 1891 dramatically changed the feel of the church and probably provided most of the current furnishings. There's a plain Norman tub-shaped font with a 15th century octagonal pedestal. There's a nice lectern and a 1910 chandelier, probably a reproduction of a Dutch design. The windows are not great, but are interesting as a comparison with other local windows of much better quality. There are monuments on the walls to the Howes family and one to John Kyrrell, who died in 1762. There are several 18th century chest tombs in the churchyard, a strong fashion of the time, and of which we will see many more in villages nearby. The church cross, the ancient marker of pilgrimage resting places, was restored in 1901. I hope you've enjoyed our little spin around Coln St. Denis. It is really extraordinarily beautiful, this place. To give you a little example of how I feel about it, Ross, when we first arrived in this village, had a little encounter. A very nice couple, probably from the Far East, stopped off and stopped Ross and said, "Could you direct us to the Cotswolds?" Ross was able to say, "You're bang in the middle of it," which they probably geographically are. We now, with some reluctance, leave the valley of the Coln and make a leap north to a couple of the villages we picked up on our second sweep of the Cotswolds north of the A40. We're visiting the village of Hawling. It's a beautiful and classic Cotswold gem. We're going to show you round. Come with us. Hawling is described in Pevsner's architectural guide as a rather bleak North Cotswold hamlet, once much larger, given a civilised air by Georgian additions to the church and especially the manor house, the latter faced in beautiful ashlar stone. My addition is dated as revised 24 years ago, but even allowing for that, the word bleak is not one I would use to describe this little place in the summer of 2024. It may be that trees and shrubs have grown up to shelter the place, but the impression I get is one of coziness and warmth, almost the opposite of bleak. It seems the manor house was built in about 1600 for the Stratford family, whose name reminded me of a memorable little chapel of ease in another hamlet just a few miles away, Farmcote. Evans, our constant companion in the Cotswolds for the last 7 years, describes at Farmcote Chapel the Elizabethan tomb on the north side of the altar with 2 effigies in local stone, doubtless cut by a local artist, over which are the arms of the Stratford family. My memory of the tomb is that it appears to have been made away from the chapel, and when the artist came to install it, he discovered that he'd made it too long for the space available. The effigies therefore had been cut off at the ankles. Witness, please, my unacademic approach to this job. Evans also writes that their name occurs in Nympha Libretris, or the Cotswold Muse, written by Clement Barksdale and published in 1651. Here at Hawling there is a tablet in the church to one of them, who seems to have succeeded at an early age to the family honours, for he is described as Toparca, in other words, Lord of the Manor, and after 4 happy years profitably spent at Oxford, was cut off by a fever in 1692 at the early age of 22. The manor house is now clearly much loved and beautifully kept, as is clear from a glimpse through the gates from the road. Facing the church are some very unusual elliptical windows, these inspired by an original window of similar shape in the gable of the north wing, and installed during a renovation in 1997 by Peter Yangu Associates, one of the nation's leading country house architects, conveniently based in Cirencester. Driving around this hamlet, there's a strong sense that it remains an agricultural community. The lovely farmhouses still seem to have farmyards, at least in close proximity, and frankly, I felt very much at home here. It felt the way villages did in my dim, distant youth. I hope you'll forgive me for mentioning that my day was made all the nicer by a couple in a car stopping and greeting me in an extremely friendly way, telling me they watched the show and indeed had introduced us to their friends in the USA. I think they said they came from Sulperton. I thank them for their kindness. It's always wonderful to meet those of you who watch the channel. The Church of St Edward has a very simple interior. The windows are lovely, but unusually, all of them are clear glass. The interior is therefore bathed in natural light, and you can see the trees swaying gently in the breeze, reminding you of the beauty that lies outside. There is an 18th century chalice-shaped font with some 19th century carving at the top, and the oak pulpit is also 18th century, along with, I suspect, the cut-down pews. Outside, just south of the church, there's a lovely tea-caddy chest tomb, and the very nice lich gate is a memorial of the Great War. On this occasion, we introduce to our rather unusual and spoiled life Siona Williams, a brilliant drone pilot and camera operator who, we hope, will be seduced by the amazing surroundings in which we work to join us on occasions in the future when 2 cameras or drones are ideal. How could she possibly resist? I hope you've enjoyed our little trip around Hawling. It's really beautiful hidden away here, this fantastic little church. Plain, as you've discovered, but very nice. Finally, for this compilation, we chase up an old idol of mine in the sleepy and ancient settlement of Turkdean. This place is a kind of classic Cotswold gem. Very unspoiled indeed, quiet as a mouse, and a lovely little church. We're going to show you around. Come with us. I approached this tiny, peaceful village from the north. On the way from Bourton-on-the-Water down the A436, the lane to Turkdean is on your left and leads you through some wonderfully unspoiled countryside. Not far down this little lane, I came across an unusual sight. Acres and acres of land left fallow, wild flowers all over the place, very large tracts of land, looking for all the world like so much of this land might have looked several hundred years ago. I find it interesting the degree to which at first glance my spirits were lifted by this sight. We've come as a species to feel extremely guilty that our presence and influence has been so detrimental to our surroundings that we welcome any sign of stepping backwards. Hence my original reaction. However, I have a niggling concern. Amongst the myriad of beautiful wildflower colours was a very considerable spattering of yellow, which, unless I am hopelessly mistaken, was a plant called ragwort. When I was a kid in the 1950s and 60s, growing up in the countryside, ragwort was seen as a seriously problematic plant. If eaten by horses or cattle, it is extremely poisonous. Now, these animals aren't stupid enough to eat the easily identifiable live plant with its bright yellow flowers, but if it is cut or falls over and dies, it becomes far less easy to see without diminishing its poison. We, as children, therefore, were charged with what we were told was a great responsibility of pulling any ragwort plant from the ground whenever we saw it and taking it to be burned on the bonfire, something all country places had in those days, almost permanently hot. Now, I have absolutely no idea of the landowner's plans for this fallow land. Indeed, I'm highly conscious that it's none of my business. But does he intend to cut it, in which case he will be laying poisonous traps all over it? Or does he intend to leave it all for nature, firstly to do the same, and then to revert first to scrub and eventually to woodland? Or maybe I am simply so old-fashioned that everything I'm saying is nonsense, in which case I'm sure you will let me know. Arriving in Turkdean, you're immediately aware of the peace and tranquility of the place. It's tiny, perfectly formed, and clearly extremely welcoming. We quickly got into conversation with a church warden who told us much about the village and, naturally, about the church. British History Online tells us that the principal water spring on Chalk Hill on the northeast side of the Turkdean Valley, one of many in the valley issuing from the band of Fuller's Earth above the village, feeds a stone-lined culvert, probably associated with a Roman settlement that lasted on the hillside until at least the 4th century. This goes a long way to explain the way the village is laid out. I do love it when it becomes so clear that people have appreciated the benefits of living in a particular place for so many centuries. The Church of All Saints is originally Norman and would have been just a nave and chancel. Later a tower was added to the western end of the nave. There are Norman remnants in this church. Half of a Norman doorway arch with chevron decorations appears in the outside north wall, and in the south wall of the chancel there has been reset the upper half of a tiny Norman doorway. The chancel arch is in the Norman style, but probably 19th century. As with almost all the churches we come across, alterations have been made at several times over the centuries. The font is rumoured to be a replica of an earlier damaged perpendicular font, and there is a nice solid stone pulpit. The rood screen, which until quite recently was in its intended position under the chancel arch, has now been moved to the south wall, where you can see its vivid coloured decoration. There is a large but very faint wall painting, probably 14th century, of a figure you might have expected to be St. Christopher, traditionally depicted on church walls, but this one appears not to have the Christ child on his shoulders. There's also some good stained glass. The east window is probably from around 1850, and the lovely south aisle window is even more recent. It dates from 1937. I have to admit, however, that the most exciting thing for me about this church is one of its congregation members, and a regular musical contributor to its choir, its services, and its fundraising events. Somewhere close by, lives a man I first saw and was introduced to in London's Marquee Club in the 1960s. He was and remains one of the most talented and natural musicians I've ever come across. He was the core of a band called the Spencer Davis Group, and his name is Steve Winwood. I'm not ashamed to say I get a frisson of starstruckness just writing his name. I'll clearly have to start going to church in Turkdean. I hope you've enjoyed our little trip around Turkdean. It's a tiny place. Tread lightly when you come here because it is undisturbed. It could have something to do with the contrast between where we were earlier this morning, because it doesn't appear so, but we were actually filming this morning in Bolton-on-the-Water, which is very touristy indeed. Turkdean is deserted, peaceful and lovely. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You can find us on all the normal platforms, and you'll find us very soon somewhere else in the Cotswolds.